חולם על מדינת ישראל שבה עם ישראל קובע את עתידו בעצמו באמת. הדמוקרטיה הישראלית היא אחד הניסים הגדולים ביותר של הציונות. בפעם הראשונה בהיסטוריה.
That's what it sounded like 2 weeks ago when Dan Illouz made his inaugural speech to Israel's Knesset as part of the ruling Likud party. Illouz spoke about democracy and that the best years were ahead for the Zionist dream. And for Illouz, being there was also a dream come true, while his parents and his family watched proudly from the gallery. Because Illouz is Canadian, or he was until a few weeks ago. He had to give up his Canadian citizenship when he took his seat in the Knesset. Illouz is the son of Moroccan immigrants to Montreal, where he grew up. He graduated from École Maïmonide and Herzliya High School and McGill Law School, where he was politically active and dabbled in campus politics. But it was after he moved to Israel for good 13 years ago that his political career really took off. He was a Jerusalem city councillor. Then he joined Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud slate in the recent election, and he beat an Ethiopian and a Russian for the immigrant seat. Illouz, as a rookie MK, got the nod to liaise with English and French-speaking Israeli immigrants. But it's his own initiative, he says, to sell his new government's policies to the Jewish diaspora, which is why his office reached out to talk to me and the CJN, and we agreed. Especially because it's a chance to address how his government is responding to protests from inside Israel and out about what some call reforms, but what others call a hard move to the extreme right.
I think it's fully legitimate not to agree with my point of view that says that these things are needed or that these things are good, but to claim that this is something which makes Israel less democratic or undemocratic, I think is false. I think it's unfair.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, February the 21st, 2023. Welcome to the CJN Daily, a podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, sponsored by Metropia. And we're coming to you this week from Delray, Florida. Dan Illouz has a unique perspective. He's one of only 4 people with Canadian upbringing ever to sit in the Knesset. After he made Aliyah, he served in the IDF. He held some political staffer jobs with Likud MKs. And it was actually from Israel that he put together a group supporting former Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper's failed bid to get re-elected in 2015. Now, Illouz is capitalizing on his communication skills and his Canadian roots to turn the megaphone around and to sell his government's controversial agenda to his former home turf. I spoke to him from his Knesset office in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, it's great to meet you. Congratulations on your maiden speech a couple of weeks ago in the Knesset, which I watched.
And it was a very, very emotional day for me.
I read and I saw, of course, we're recording on Monday as the Knesset is opening debate on the judicial reforms. I don't know if you were able to see the protests outside. Could you describe what you saw as you walked in?
I definitely saw the protests. So let's first say that I am a strong supporter of the reforms. I think that they're good for Israel, good for Israel's democracy. I do want to say that when I saw the protests outside, I saw very caring Israelis that have a different opinion than I do, who want to see a different policy approved. And so I really respect the protesters. I don't think that I should show any disrespect for them. They're caring, they're patriotic. We're just disagreeing. I hope that the leaders of the opposition would say the same thing about me and understand that we're not trying to bring the end of the democracy or anything. We're fixing things which need to be fixed within the Israeli judicial system. I'm a McGill Law graduate. And so I had an argument actually with my former professor, Erwin Kotler. He's opposed to the reforms. I'm for the reforms, but we both agreed that this isn't a question of whether Israel will be a democracy or not. We're disagreeing about what the best way to apply democracy in Israel is. And that's a fair disagreement, which is legitimate. I definitely think that Erwin Kotler is a huge patriot when it comes to his Jewish values. He's a Canadian patriot, of course, but also an Israeli, a very strong supporter of Israel. And we disagree on this issue, which is fine. It's fair to disagree as long as we realize that those are legitimate disagreements and we don't start calling each other names or claiming that one person is a dictator or fascist or all of these things that they've started calling us on the right. And so that's basically how I feel today.
Well, I mean, I was going to ask you about the protests. It's not just the people who disagree. Of course, the president went on a public speech, Isaac Herzog, and said there might be civil war. Sitting here from the diaspora, you must be aware of how Jewish community outside of Israel is reacting. You've seen, I'm sure, all the delegations saying, especially even religious delegations and conservative delegations, not just the Reform and the left, expressing deep concern. What did you hear directly as the sort of Ola voice and the Canadian, voice? What are people telling you directly from Canada?
So again, I hear, and I want to not minimize the amount of worry that there is, because I agree with you that people are worrying, and I hear that people are worried. People who care deeply about Israel are worried about Israel's future. I think that most of the worries is based on the misunderstanding of what these reforms are meant to accomplish, and that's part of the reason why I'm on this interview right now, because I think that it's very important to give a clearer picture about what these reforms are meant to bring. The way I see it, those reforms are making Israel closer to the way all other democracies are functioning right now. Whether we're speaking about the nomination of judges, which usually is done in the either the legislative branch or the executive branch. So in Israel, we're strengthening the power that the legislative and the executive branch have. By the way, we're keeping in judges in the nomination committee. That's something that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, but we're still, in order not to make too drastic of a change, we're keeping them in the committee. The override clause is something that exists in other democratic countries. Canadians know that, obviously, because it's in Canada, but it exists also in some parts of Australia. In Australia, they have a system, which it depends on which parts you're talking about. And there's also other countries where the courts don't have any right of judicial review. They're not allowed to cancel laws at all, whether we're talking about Britain or New Zealand. And so if you don't have the right to cancel laws, then obviously you don't have an override clause at all. And so all of these things are things that exist in other democratic countries. Again, and I think that if we were to frame the debate, as a legitimate debate, which I think it is, again, between people that are for judicial restraint against people who are more prone to judicial activism. By the way, we spoke about Erwin Cotler. Erwin Cotler is someone who liked judicial activism also within Canada. He's very consistent in his views, which is fine. It's his opinion. I'm more of a person who likes judicial restraint. And again, there's a lot of people that agree with me. It's a legitimate debate. As long as we frame it as a legitimate debate, I think that a lot of the fears and the worries that a lot of, again, very Israel-loving people are expressing would come down. I'm not the type of person that would demonize the people that are against things that I believe in. I think that it's okay for them to disagree with me. I would just like to put things in the right perspective.
Well, you mentioned disagree. And in your maiden speech or your inaugural speech, and in your platforms, you've talked a lot about how free market economy is key for you, including all the other reforms. And yet, so many people that we interview say, we're not going to go to Israel. Israel's getting bad press everywhere. It's making it difficult for us to support Israel. So the fallout from this debate that's going on outside of Israel may be actually real. You may be feeling it economically. I'm not, boycotts, and of course, people who don't want to do business because of this. What do you have to say to that?
I think that right now there's a lot of stress on the relations between Israel and the diaspora Jewry because of this issue. But once people see that the result of the reforms is a vibrant democracy that's even more vibrant than what there was before, then all of the worries will go down and we'll see a very strong relationship. By the way, about the business part of things, the reform I think is incredibly good for business. One of the most important things in business is for people to have some type of clarity as to what the law is. And the more activist the judges are, the less clear what the law is becomes, because people end up not knowing whether the letter of the law is what will be applied or whether the interpretation of the judges is what will be applied. And so by making judges more restrained and judicial review more restrained, then we're actually helping business. And I think on the economic side of things, Israel will only gain from this reform also.
We need to move on to a topic which is close to your heart as well. I know that a few weeks ago, the 7 people who were murdered at the synagogue by terrorists and the 2 brothers who were rammed. So when the world watches the increasing violence and the efforts to try to crack down on terrorists, you supported a bill to strip, or an effort to strip terrorists of their citizenship recently. And I wondered, what do you see as the solution in the short term?
I think that there's 2 sides to the coin. On the one hand, we have to have a very strong hand against the terrorists, and those are some of the legislations that you've described are some of our responses. We have to make it clear to the terrorists and to the people supporting them that we will not allow these things to happen. The other side of the coin is to make it clear that we're here to stay. And that's why I also support a lot of the things that we're doing in order to enhance our presence all around Israel, whether it's new yishuvim, I don't know how we say that in English, but
settlements, right,
that are being legalized in Judea and Samaria, or whether it's other things in that line of thought. I started also promoting steps against education, which is hateful education, which is currently given within Eastern Jerusalem. You should know that one of the terrorists in the past 3 weeks was a 13-year-old boy, who obviously, when a 13-year-old boy commits a terrorist action, which is full of hatred, it's not. I tend to believe that people at 13-year-old aren't so hateful just on their own. There's something which is feeding that flame of hate. And what's happening right now in the eastern parts of Jerusalem is that a lot of schools teach according to the Palestinian authorities' system and with their textbooks, which include pure incitement against Jews. They include people calling terrorists heroes, such as Dalal Mughrabi, which was a terrorist that killed 35 Israelis. Not alone, she was part of a group of 4 terrorists that killed 35 Israelis. And so those are the types of role models that they have at 13 years old. And so everyone wants to be like their role models at 13 years old, right? And so they end up committing these terrorist crimes. So when it comes to the education system, it's also something which I plan to address, and it's something that I've already addressed. And we've had one discussion in the Knesset. We're going to have another one next week, and hopefully we'll enforce also the current laws, by the way, should be enough in order to stop this incitement, but they're just not applied correctly.
Let's talk about Canada's funding for UNRWA, because you were a supporter of Stephen Harper before you moved to Israel, or actually maybe even in Israel. And
as an Israeli, I tried not to, but yeah. Okay.
Well, you worked for the party, obviously.
Canada, I voted Stephen Harper. You can.
But you were also, raising money. You were an activist person for him. I mean, it's been in the press too. It's nothing to. The government under Stephen Harper stopped funding UNRWA, and the current government funds it. And UNRWA has been proven to fund this kind of incitement education. What message do you have now for the Canadian government's policies with this?
Listen, I'll start by saying something which is important for me to say, and that's that Israel really appreciates Canada's friendship. I think that Canada over the years has become closer and closer with Israel. And even if we don't always agree on everything, there's a clear line of friendship between us. And it doesn't matter whether it's a conservative government or whether it's a liberal government. The friendship exists. We feel it. We see it also in voting patterns in the UN. It wasn't always that way, by the way. When I grew up, I don't think it was that way. But nowadays you see it, including with this liberal government, and then we do have to give credit to the current government on that. And I appreciate that as an Israeli. When it comes to the disagreements, then yes, there are a lot of disagreements also. Funding of UNRWA is definitely one of them. UNRWA uses those very textbooks that I was talking about that are full of incitement. It's not only that, also the fact that Canada didn't follow America's leadership when it comes to the embassy in Jerusalem is something that makes me sad as a Jerusalemite, someone that was in the Jerusalem City Council and now is a member of Knesset. I wish they did. I think it's clear that they should, because Jerusalem is Israel's capital. It's the Jewish people's eternal capital. And so there are some issues of disagreement. But again, it's within the framework of a strong friendship, which I strongly appreciate also.
Right, because our government just sent out two statements in the last couple of weeks condemning Israel for the settlement building and for violence, which the tone has changed in the last couple of statements that the Canadian government put out.
I definitely disagree with that. I strongly support Judea and Samaria as being a part of Israel. I support applying Israeli sovereignty in large parts of Judea and Samaria, at least in areas seized. And so I definitely am in disagreement with the Canadian policy when it comes to that. But I disagree. I see it as a disagreement between friends, and that's a legitimate thing.
You mentioned recently, and I think one of your staffers sent it to us as well, about your efforts to rescue 50,000 French Jews from France and bring them to Israel because of rising anti-Semitism. How do you deal with, or how do you navigate what Israel's doing with the rise in anti-Semitism? Because we feel it in Canada, in school boards, in social media. I'm sure you're aware.
I spoke about France because there were some murders there, right? Some terrorist actions in France, which really signify the urgency of at least allowing and helping the people who want to move to Israel to do so efficiently. I'm not now talking about convincing people who don't want to move to Israel and to start to get them to move here, but rather to allow the people who already want to. There's around 50,000 who have expressed interest, and to make it easier for them. When it comes to anti-Semitism in other countries, then I will say that I plan on opening the Diaspora caucus in the Knesset, which a large part of it will be to be more attentive to the needs of the different diaspora communities and to focus on things where I think we'll all agree they're problematic. For example, the problem of anti-Semitism, the problem of BDS, the problem on campuses, all of these problems, and to see how we as a Knesset can help on these issues. It hasn't opened yet just for bureaucratic reasons, but once it will, then I hope to really use this tool in order to enhance the relationship between diaspora and Israel.
That's what the minister Nachman Shai said when he came to Canada last May. And I asked him similar questions about diaspora. I mean, it was in the previous government. But, coming here, how often do you get to Canada, or how often do you plan to sort of visit?
So I actually will be the head of the parliamentary friendship group between Canada and Israel. And so it probably means that I will visit a lot. Thank God, I like Canada. I love Canada. I never left Canada because I didn't love it, right? I love Canada. I left Canada out of Zionism. And so I'm very happy that I will get a chance as a member of Knesset to be there very often. One of the hardest things I had to do, by the way, as a new member of Knesset, was to renounce my Canadian citizenship, because that's part of the Israeli law. And so that was actually one of the hardest things that I had to do, because I care deeply for Canada.
Are you still, do you still follow hockey?
I wish that there was less of a time difference, but people keep telling me that it's a good thing that I don't follow hockey this year because the Habs aren't doing too well, right? So
yes, that is very true. But that's the you get the good draft picks. So one of the things in the diaspora, as you know, is a huge issue for us, not so much maybe for Israelis, is access to the Western Wall and equal rights for the Reform, conservative, and non-Orthodox prayer. How do you feel about this?
I think that's what we need as a responsible government, is to keep the status quo when it comes to religion and state. I know that there's people pushing in both directions. That's usually a sign that the status quo is a compromise, and that means that the status quo is good, because status quo is supposed to be a compromise, which both sides don't like very much, but that allows for us to live together. And I think that's what it does now. I know that there's elements in the coalition that are trying to change the status quo, but we in the Likud have made it clear that we will not let this happen. We will keep the status quo the way it is. And I know that this worries a lot of people in the diaspora, so I can just reiterate here that we won't let it happen. The status quo will stay. it allows us to, on the one hand, have a Jewish state with a Jewish identity, but on the other hand, allow for full religious freedom of everyone in Israel. Freedom is one of the things that I want to promote as an MK, right? It has to do with my free market ideals and things like that. Freedom is a word which means a lot to me. And so it's one of the things that are on my agenda. That includes also freedom to worship the way people please, the way people want. And that will definitely be something that I will not allow to happen. And the Likud, that's the Likud's agenda. It's not just my own personal agenda. The Prime Minister has said it over and over again, even though it's not ideal for any of the two sides.
Right. I guess if everyone hates you, you know you're doing something right.
Something along those lines.
It's been an honor to meet you.
Thank you.
By the way, today is Daniel Illouz's 37th birthday. And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia. Integrity, community, quality, and customer care. Today's listener shout-out goes to Elliot Katz of Toronto. He's the author of several books, including How to Be the Strong Man a Woman Wants. And we'll end with a bit of what it sounded like on the weekend in the United Arab Emirates when a Canadian rabbi, Yehuda Sarna, also of Montreal originally, helped inaugurate the country's stunning new synagogue in Abu Dhabi. It's called the Moses Ben Maimon Synagogue. The building is the first standalone, purposely built shul to open in the Gulf in 100 years. It's part of the UAE's tolerance outreach to Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
We believe that this is the first new purpose-built synagogue in the region in almost 100 years. We will remember this for the rest of our lives. Amen.